All right, let's bring that beat back.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you're watching live or you are watching the recording. I just appreciate you tuning in. In this module, we're talking about JavaScript objects. And we're talking about them in basically two separate sorts of formats. Right, this week we're basically talking about the standard object and working with sort of the standard object in its standard form. And next week we'll be talking about JavaScript object notation, or JSON, and how we can expand that out to use that with external files, JSON files, and APIs. So that's going to be the plan, and maybe to kind of ease our transition, since next week is a holiday week, I might post a previously recorded video later on in the week, maybe Thursday or Friday, just to get a head start on next week so we don't have to do quite as much next Monday, just so we already have a bunch of stuff underneath us for that, so we don't have to be cramming as much in before the holiday next week. So I believe that's what we will be doing over the course of this week. Just looking at JavaScript objects. And this is sort of an extension of what we were talking about with arrays previously, right? When we work with arrays, we can work with them in a similar manner, or when we work with objects, especially when we work with JSON, which we'll be talking about in the future more, we can work with them very similarly to how we can work with arrays. And I'll do an example today kind of showing you how you can work with objects and arrays kind of together. Right, and so that's going to be kind of our goal for today. So we'll talk about what an array is, and we'll do some examples, and we'll do some good stuff here as we get going. We're talking about JavaScript objects. And so, in order to get us started, let's first just do like we would normally do and define our terms. So what exactly is an object? So the JavaScript object is a collection of key value pairs. So whenever we see the JavaScript object in the way that we're working with it today, or we see it in the JSON format, which JSON just stands for JavaScript Object Notation, so it's basically just the same sort of format as a regular JavaScript object, just put forth into a flat file to be used in a different sort of way, to where we can actually access files across the web, which is what makes JSON files incredibly useful for things like APIs. What we see is a key value pair situation. So similar to a dictionary in Python or a hash table in Java or any other programming language that you've ever kind of worked with, you know, when you've seen this sort of key value pair structure where we have a key that we can reference and a value that we can reference, then we can kind of go through and access that as such. Now, one of the interesting things is that anything that's not a primitive in JavaScript is an object by default, right? And so when we talk about primitives in JavaScript, we're talking about data types. And so our primitives in JavaScript, there are 7 of them. They are string, number, big int or integer, Boolean, undefined, symbol, and null. These are our primitive data types. Which means that when we were working with an array last week, we were actually working with an object. It was just an object that JavaScript handles on the back end of the language, instead of an object that we define and create. Which makes things, you know, really, really, really interesting. Right, and one of the things that we get into in the idea of, you know, primitive versus object is the concept of mutability. Right, we talk about mutability in some other programming languages that we deal with, you know, the concept of something being mutable means that it is able to be changed. It's able to be manipulated. So primitives in JavaScript are immutable. Right? When we are, for example, replacing a string in a variable, we're not changing the string in place. We have to take that string out of the variable and put a new string into the variable. However, when we look at something like an array, which we just said was an object, arrays are mutable. So I can update an array in place, which is something that we were doing last week. right? As we were kind of changing the values that are inside of our array as it kind of goes forward. And it is sort of tough to tell sometimes when things are mutable versus when things are immutable, right? For example, when we think about the idea of incrementation, right, we think about the idea of adding 1 to a number inside of a variable. And so if an integer is a primitive, then we think, oh, well, we're just adding adding 1 to a number that's inside of a variable. But what we're actually doing in these cases is that we're taking that number out of that variable, we're adding 1 to it, and we're replacing that number that's currently in the variable with the new value. Right, so when it comes to objects, objects make up everything, basically, in our JavaScript programming language, except for the primitives. So really, it's the foundation of everything. So when we think about an object, what we're essentially doing with an object, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, is we're essentially taking a copy of something and making a copy of it in memory so that we can use it. So when we think about an array, we have an array object, and we can add things to our array object. So we can make multiple copies of an array object and update and change and manipulate that array object as we see fit. And so even though we have these objects that are inside of JavaScript already, that we're already using, and we didn't even realize were objects, we can also make our own objects in an array. Now, when we think about making our own objects, one of the first things that we need to think about is how an object is organized. And so when we think about that, an object is a collection of properties. Right, we can go back and we can think about CSS, right, when we're thinking about how an object is related or organized. Right, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself when I'm talking about relationships because we are talking about key value pairs here. Right, so we have a relationship between a key and a value. So an object is a collection of properties, and a property is a key value pair. And so we can kind of think about it in terms of CSS, right? We're kind of used to CSS. CSS pretty easy for a lot of us. We have some element selector that we can use. In that case, we can kind of make that be like our object. And then we can, inside of that element, as we have selected something, we can choose to have rules. And these rules consist of a property and a value, right? We call these declarations. And so here with our object, we have some sort of baseline object that we can create. And inside of that baseline object, we can establish some rules. And these rules consist of a property, which is a key value pair, or a name and a value. Now, one thing is that a property name is a unique value that can be coerced to a string. Now, when I say coerced to a string, that means that it can basically be written as a string. Right? So when we're talking about the property name, we're basically talking about anything that can be good to use as a variable name. Anything that we can use well as a variable name, we can also use as a property name. Then a property value can be basically anything, right? Including other objects. In this case, when we're saying including other objects, we're talking about things like arrays, right? Or references to other objects that we create. So things like arrays, other objects that we create, functions that we write, right? We can create a function and then make a call to a function inside of an array or inside of an object, and then return the value out of that function that would return it back to the object. Anything of that nature that we can associate with the name, which in this case would be the key. So if we were to look at an example of something like that, we could see something like this. Right, so in this case, we see here that we're establishing it as a constant. And we have this constant here, we've named it object. Right, and the structure here seems like really similar. Right, like we've seen this structure time and time and time and time and time and time again. Right, so we have this constant called object, and we've established this object, and it's been established as a variable, a container. Right, we have this container now, and this container becomes an object container here once we introduce these curly braces. And then inside of these curly braces, we put these key value pairs. Right, we see on the left of our colon there, that's our key. Right, we see these names that are, string coercible. Hello to world. And then doing good and true. Right, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to switch over to a little example now, just so we can work on a little bit of an example here. Get into a bit of a Visual Studio Code window here. So we'll pull up a terminal window. And we'll just create ourselves a folder for this project. Now we can open it up here in Visual Studio Code. Find Web 215. And there's the folder that we made here. And for our purposes here, I'm going to create two folders. I'm going to create an index, or I'm going to create two files, rather. I'm going to create an index.html. And I am going to create a script.js. Right, no CSS, at least not yet. Let me switch over to full screen here. So let's add our skeleton here. Let's go ahead and throw in a title here. Let's call it JS Objects. And for the time being here, we actually don't need anything at all in our index file. Our index.html file just needs to be there. We do need to call our JavaScript file, so let's go ahead and do that at the bottom of our body here. Script src equals script.js. And so that's all we need in here for right now, right? So for the time being, what I'd like to do while we're just kind of getting started with this is just to do a little bit of stuff that we're just going to see in the console, right? So I'm going to return it out to the console. Or actually, you know what? It might be just a good idea just to throw it up on the page, just so we can see it on the page. So let's go ahead and we'll open this up with Live Server. And we'll go ahead and put up our blank website here. And I'll put an empty H1 here, just ready to accept our output here. Instead of writing it out to a console, we'll just print it out to here. So in our JavaScript file, let's prepare ourselves a bit of an object. So I'm going to create a constant for Yeti. And I'm going to set that equal to, and we've got some key value pairs here, or, property value, whatever we want to call them. So I want to say is named and set that equal to, let's say, Freddy the Yeti. And we'll set an is mysterious, and we'll set that equal to true. And actually, I did put semicolons in the demo there, but that should be commas, and I did put colons in the demo. The colons are correct, right? Wait. So let me see here. Let's put that there. Yeah, I should have commas here. Commas for JavaScript object notation. And so this is my JavaScript object, right? It's called Yeti. And so I have this object called Yeti. And Yeti has all these properties. Yeti is named. Yeti is mysterious. And so from here, if I wanted to, I could console log these. Console.log Yeti.property. So dot is named. So if we look at that, and I console.logged this, we should be able to check our inspect element. We should be able to look into our console, and we see right there, Yeti is named Freddy. Freddy the Yeti. So based on that, I've given these properties here, so I should be able to include that inside of my H1 as well, right? So we should just be able to write a document.query selector h1.inner HTML equals the Yeti's name is, and concatenate that with Yeti dot is named. And when we look at that, we see the Yeti's name is Freddy. But we have more than just that property there. We have other properties, and we can put as many properties as we want in here, in this JavaScript object. And this is our most basic object example. Right, and we could even go so far as like using, our is mysterious true here to, write a conditional or do whatever else. So this is our most basic example of a JavaScript object. But it's probably not our most useful example of a JavaScript object. You see, what we've seen here is called a literal. This is a JavaScript. This is an example of an object as a JavaScript literal. Meaning that everything in our object has been previously declared as declared by default. So the declaration is done basically the exact same way that you would declare a variable. And I have this bullet point here that says there are other ways to create JavaScript objects. For simplicity's sake, we'll stick to literals. Kind of yes and no. Right, because you can use the prototype way. We won't get into the prototype way. But there are some other ways that are less literal that we'll be using as an example. So once we set an object, we can set an object properties. So once we have an object, we can go back and change these properties. Right? Or we can add properties to it using accessors. So valid property names include anything that can be coerced to a string, again. Right? So we can just make up property names on the fly. So basically anything that can be used as a variable name, we can also use it as a property name for our JavaScript object. And we can also change properties in a similar manner. Right? So let's look at an example here of what we can do, right? If we were to look at an example, in this example here, we have nothing in our Yeti object. But if we do Yeti.isMysterious and set that equal to true, then that in turn is going to actually add that value to a property as a part of the object. So we don't have to declare it when we create the object. We just have to make sure that we have the object name and what we have before the period there set as the same thing. So we could even go so far as to change things here. Right, I could change, and we can change things and we can add things. Like we could change the value of Yeti.isNamed. Right, Yeti.isNamed already exists, but we could change it in this case. Right, and we could call this Yeti Betty. Right, and this is now Betty, the Yeti. And so now if we look at that here, the Yeti's name is Betty. So we didn't have to go back into our object here to change things. We were just able to change things on the fly. We could add a Yeti.isMarried and set that equal to true. And we can see that if we save that and add that in here, we have a true right there. Right, ideally we'd probably want to concatenate another space onto that. Just to make that even better, right? Make it make more sense. So with what we're working with here, right? Like, this is just to show us that, we don't necessarily have to declare everything inside of our object for it to work. We can have everything in other places. This gives us a little bit more flexibility. Now what you see here are actually something that we call getters and setters. Right, when we look at yeti.isMarried or yeti.isNamed, this is an example of a setter. Right, we're setting a value into our object. In fact, I've got that on a slide here. So let's bring that back. So when we look at our object.somePropertyName, we're getting a value and we're setting a value. Now, when we are using that value from the object and storing it in some variable, then it becomes a getter. So we are getting a value from the object and we are putting it elsewhere, right? So in our example, in the output, when we are using in our example here, when we are adding our value to the output to show it on our page, that's when it becomes a getter. Right, it's getting the value from the object and showing it on our page. At this point here, it's being utilized as a setter because we are setting a value to that property in the object. And this is the same syntax that we use basically in all of our JavaScript to be able to do the exact same thing. Now, this is all well and good. But let's do something just a little more interesting, right? Like this is a little too simple for what we're able to do. What I would like to do is I'd like to be able to use an object function. Right? Because I think it's really nice and I think it's really simple for us to be able to create key value pairs like that and basically to be able to create multiple variables for one item that we can refer to by their properties and have that all work and be all well and good. but there aren't a whole lot of applications for it. There are way more applications for object functions. And one of the easiest ways to create an object that you want to make multiple copies of is by establishing that object as a function. So one of the things that we've said was, one of the big deals of objects is that we can take it, we can make a copy of it in memory, and then we can refer to that copy of it. It uses the same structure. We can refer to that copy of that structure and, use it with different data, use it in different ways. Now, in doing so, we want to make sure that we're using the function keyword instead of the JavaScript arrow function notation. Because one of the things that we're going to want to use is the this keyword. And when we use arrow notation, basically the this keyword doesn't really work, right? The this keyword works much differently than it does when in an arrow function notation than in just a standard function. So we want to even though we're getting used to arrow functions, we want to break ourselves of arrow functions here. And we want to just use a regular function. Because the function keyword will scope our keyword for this, will scope our this keyword for this particular function. Whereas the arrow function uses the global this. Right? So let's look at an example here. Right? And we'll do something very similar as our example here. And we'll build it into a website. So what we can see here is we've created this structure called animal. We've created an object called animal. And we've basically said that each animal object has three things: a name, an icon, and a number of legs. And so what we see here is the name, the icon, and the legs here are parameters. So we've talked about parameters in the past in other classes. One of the things that we've said about parameters are that parameters are basically, you can think about parameters like that pneumatic tube at the bank. Right? Parameters give me the ability to take something from outside of my function and bring it inside of my function. Right? So I can take things from outside of my function and bring them into my function. So I can take pieces of data like dog and an emoji and a number. Right? Which is what we're doing here. So in this instance, what we're doing is we're creating a name for this particular instance of an object, which is what this.name is. So the property for a particular instance of this object is called name, which would mean that the property name for dog is different than the property name for chicken, because it is for this particular instance. Right, so what we see on the right-hand side here of our equal symbols, and you can see this is written a little bit differently here. Right, and that's because it's a function instead of our constant like we've seen before. What we see on the right-hand side of our equal symbol here maps out to our parameters. And so when we're saying this dot name here, what we're saying is the name property of this particular object, whatever this particular object might be. For example, in this case here, it's dog. In this case here, it's chicken. Dog.name is the dog parameter. Chicken.name is the chicken parameter, and so on and so forth. Right, so let's basically do this in our example here. So I'm going to create a function here, function, and I'm going to call it animals. And you'll see here that what we're doing here is we're actually uppercasing the A in animals. And that in and of itself isn't doing anything code-wise, but it is a standard nomenclature that shows that basically this is an object. This is a function class, basically. And we're going to give it these three parameters that we were given on our slide there. Name, icon, and legs. And we can add another one that's maybe is eaten. Right, so now we have name, icon, legs, and is eaten. Right, so each time we create a new animal, and ideally we want to make that singular there, so this is going to be this dot name equals name. This dot icon equals icon. This dot legs equals legs. This dot is eaten equals is eaten. So now we can create. So now we have this function that we can take, and we can create any new instance of a function, or any new object that we can kind of pass in here and create a new instance of this animal object. So for example, we can create a constant, and we can call it dog. And we can set that equal to a new animal. And then we would just define these four properties. Name is dog. Icon is some emoji. Legs is some numerical value 4. Is eaten would be a Boolean false. Right? Because I don't think dogs are traditionally eaten in this particular culture, right? So now if we were to, for example, console.log dog.icon, right? Dog is a new instance of our animal object. So dog extends animal. The name is dog. The icon is the icon we've given it. If we look at our site and we look at our inspect element tool here, we can look at our console. We have to save, would be ideal. And we see there's our little dog emoji right there. And we can do this for any number of animals, right? So we can const cat equals new animal, cat, add an icon here, add a little cat emoji, number of legs, and false. Const chicken is a new animal. Chicken. We'll give it an icon. Right, again, as we're doing this, right, the big deal here is automation. Right, and once we get into the idea of extending this through JSON and things of that nature, right, you'll see the automation grow even further. Right, so that's 2 legs, and that would be a true. There, and let's do fish. Const fish equals new animal. Fish. Give it an icon. Zero legs. And true. Not all of them, but many of them, so we'll just go ahead and say true. So each time what's happening here is we're creating a new instance of this animal function in memory. And each time we're creating a new object based on the information that we have here with our animal function. So we have dog and all of the properties for dog, cat and all of the properties for cat, chicken and all of the properties for chicken, fish and all of the properties for fish. So instead of creating this sort of structure every time for all of these animals, we can create that structure once and apply it to as many animals as we'd like. Now from here, we can go a lot of different directions. Right? For example, one of the places that we could go is we could take all of these and we could put them in an array. Right? So let's take and make an array of, we'll call it A. Const A is going to be an array that has dog, cat, chicken, and fish in it. And so now I can go through that array, iterate over that array, and do something different for that array each time, right? So let's have a look at this. So we can create a little for loop here, or we can just write it. We can write a function. So let's write a little create paragraph function. So we can do this one as a arrow notation function if we want to. Create paragraph equals and we could say if, or actually the first thing we'd want to do is we'd want to write an enhanced for loop to iterate over our A array here. So for I of, and let's write let I of A. And we can write an if I dot is eaten, right? Because that's a Boolean. That's going to give me true or false. I can start to write some information about that. And I can say, oh, let's go, Let's add a main to our index, right? Just to give ourselves another container to point at. And we can even write a little constant for, and this is actually kind of similar to the way that React works as well, as you're kind of building with it, is that you are taking and pointing a bunch of different code at a singular set of tags in your HTML, and it works like that. Document dot query selector main. So we can say main dot inner HTML plus equals a paragraph that says, let's start off with the icon. So we'll concatenate with i.icon. We'll concatenate a little space in there, and we'll concatenate that with i dot what did we call it? I dot name. So we can have our icon there. We can have, and this is only if it is eaten, right? If it meets, if this is true, right? So we have the name has some number of legs, right? So I dot legs. And it is delicious. Close P. Right? Else, we can say, we can use the same code. Right? We can say, it is a friend to us. Right? If it's not eaten, it's a friend. Friend's not food, right? Like that one movie that I can't remember what it was right offhand. Right? And so now if we save this and we look at our site. I know what I've done wrong because I haven't called my function yet. So all I need to do here is call my function. And we should be able to see the results of our labor here, like so. So now we see dog has 4, and there should be 4 legs. Legs and so let's do that instead, right? And it is a friend to us. Cat has 4 legs, and it is a friend to us. Chicken has 2 legs, and it is delicious. Fish has 0 legs, and it is delicious. Right, we've just been able to use the information from our object. Right, and I can go back and I can add a new item here, add it to my array. right? For example, const cow equals new animal, cow, for true, add cow to our array, and it's automated. As a part of our. So hopefully you can start to see here how other things might work in this example. Right, because as we're building this structure, and as when we go into our JSON, as we get to talking about JSON, which we'll talk about next week, it works very, very similarly. The only thing that's going to be of much difference is really going to be how we bring it in, since JSON's typically a file hosted on the web instead of just some code that we write in the same JavaScript file as anything else. Right? But like, what would be the difference between this than writing like, Apple, adding a URL to a picture of an apple and putting it inside of image tags? Making one of these a price, having one of these be the department that it's in, produce or whatever, right? All of these things are things that can be done. And with our objects, things become a lot easier. And so that's where I'll stop for today. We've basically reached our hour. And so as I've mentioned, I will probably put out a video toward the end of the week that will help kind of bridge the gap between this week and next week. So we don't have as much to cover next week, so we can kind of, have less to do going into the holiday, which is next week. I am sorry for making things due on a holiday. Hopefully we can have it to where you all can get things done early on Wednesday, maybe, to where you don't have to worry about that. I want to say this is maybe the only class, maybe one other class had it worked out to where we couldn't do that. We couldn't take where I had to have the due date on Thanksgiving, but it's just the way it is, and I'm sorry. If you need another couple days to get this all sorted out, that's fine too. Just let me know. And so that's all that I have for you for today. We'll hang out and chat with the music back on for just a couple minutes, just in case anybody who's here live with me has any questions. If you're watching the recording and you have some questions, please let me know. But again, that's all that I have for you for now. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.